Mr. Whatnot is Alan Ayckbourn's sixth play. It debuted in 1964, and whilst it has been consistently revived and performed since then, it's not regarded as a classic Ayckbourn play or even an essential one to understanding the playwright. Yet Mr. Whatnot has a pivotal role to play in the development of Alan Ayckbourn as a writer and director. It is also quite unlike anything he had written or would ever write again. It is idiosyncratic, inventive and original, as well as being a very personal play. It is also the catalyst for writing his breakout play, Relatively Speaking. For these reasons alone, Mr. Whatnot is a play that deserves more attention and recognition of its significance in the Ayckbourn canon. In 1962, Alan Ayckbourn left the Library Theatre, Scarborough, where he had begun his playwriting and directing careers, and he became a founding member of the Victoria Theatre in Stoke-on-Trent. This was to become the UK's first purpose-built theatre in the round venue, and was created by Stephen Joseph, who was Alan Ayckbourn's most important mentor. Stephen didn't actually have an awful lot of involvement in the actual running of the theatre, which was passed to the artistic director Peter Cheeseman, with Alan Ayckbourn acting as a de facto deputy, writing, directing and acting. Alan wrote two new plays for the Victoria. The first was his children's play, Christmas v Mastermind, which, even by the kindest accounts, was a complete disaster and has never been seen since. The second play was Mr. Whatnot. Alan has noted that the direct inspiration for Mr. Whatnot was to write a play serving the talents of the close-knit community he had been working with for 18 months, particularly those of Peter King, who would play the lead role of the mute piano tuner Mint, which requires a high degree of mime work. As to the indirect inspiration, well, that's all the films Alan loved as a kid. He's always talked about the fact that many of his influences are cinematic rather than literary because, as a youngster, he loved going to the cinema and was rarely taken to the theatre. He developed a lifelong love for the classic silent and black and white comedians such as Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd, and directors such as René Clair. Mint follows in the footsteps of these protagonists, whom chaos invariably follows. There's also hints of the radio shows he grew up admiring, such as The Goon Show. Mr. Whatnot started by using common jargon from other media and transposing it into a theatre setting, something I've done quite a lot subsequently, says Ayckbourn. It's very much a tribute to all those films I'd seen in childhood, right from René Clair's French surreal pieces that dared to depart from Hollywood realism. They were completely surreal, and I thought, this is wonderful. It goes from one level to another without even explaining it. I love this ability to leap out of the real into the surreal. I wanted to write that in a play. So in Mr. Whatnot, there is a tea party which turns into World War I. They're throwing exploding rock buns. It's really quite bizarre, to put it mildly. What's also interesting at this point in Alan's writing career is that this is the first of his plays that he did not write a role for himself. He had appeared in all his previous plays, and he readily admits most of them were written as vehicles for him to highlight his acting skills. But Alan had now all but retired from acting, and he wrote Mr. Whatnot to show off his directing skills. He notably said, I was going through my if I can't show myself off as an actor, I'll show myself off as a director phase. The play was, as Alan's biographer Paul Allen once noted, a virtuoso role for Alan as a director. It was also a showcase for his technical skills. Mr. Whatnot, for its time, was extraordinarily complex, with more than 300 sound effects with approximately 120 sound cues. Today that doesn't sound too extreme when we're recording and operating in a digital world, but this was back in 1963, and everything was analogue and not necessarily on the most modern equipment. Alan laboriously created the sound plot, which was recorded on and operated by tape. Famously, the theatre's neighbours complained about the noise of barking one night, and Alan tells of pretending he had a dog to a local policeman to explain all the racket. It's actually a little known fact that Alan has been consistently creating sound plots for his plays practically since the start of his directing career, and can even often be heard voicing off-stage characters in his world premiere productions. This, essentially, all begins with Mr. Whatnot. The finished play is unlike anything else the playwright had written before or since. A surreal comedy that could only work on stage and which is, as a result, highly theatrical. There is no pretense at realism or comment. It is all about a fun night at the theatre into which Alan threw all those interests to create a highly personal work and a highly unique work. If anything, it is a foreshadowing of his family plays from 1988 onwards, from which he drew the confidence to throw increasingly fantastical elements into his main body of writing. As his previous play, Standing Room Only in 1961, foreshadowed his journeys into speculative fiction from the late 1980s onwards, so Mr. Whatnot anticipates his increasing confidence in pulling fantastic elements from the early 1980s forwards. This also, arguably, makes Mr. Whatnot the first truly Ayckbourn play in that the playwright's voice has yet to really define itself in his previous works. Here is a work that no one but Alan could have written. It marks his first time, ironically considering the lead character is mute, that the playwright's voice can be heard, perhaps not in the script, but in writing a play which pushes the envelope, looking to create a new theatrical experience and challenging all those involved in making it, a common attribute of many of Alan's most notable and successful works subsequent. If there is anything else to be drawn from the play, it is that Mr. Whatnot is, arguably, the prototypical Ayckbourn man who will come to be defined by the likes of Norman in the Norman Conquests, Leonard in Time and Time Again, and Dennis in Just Between Ourselves. Although an extreme version, Mint is a man whose actions innocently cause chaos and disruption around them. The Ayckbourn man rarely shows malignant intent, but his actions can be devastating to those around him, and Mint certainly falls into that category. Mr. Whatnot opened in Stoke during November 1963 and marked the first time Alan would direct a world premiere of one of his own plays. He has fond memories of it. It was my most successful play to date. It became a very, very successful production in its Stoke form and was the first original major smash we had there. Its success attracted the interest of the on-the-rise London producer, Peter Bridge, who was making a name for himself as a producer of exciting new work, and had optioned Alan's previous play, although hadn't actually done anything with it. Alan believed the original intent was to transfer the Stoke production into the West End intact, but Bridge apparently lost confidence in it and completely recast it aside from Peter King, and he appointed a new director in Warren Jenkins. He would cast Ronnie Barker, already making a name for himself in the role of Lord Slingsby Craddock, and had a cast Alan considered had been chosen for their appeal rather than for their suitability to the play, a recurring issue for Alan over the years to come in the West End. Bridge also brought in a mime specialist where none was required, and a sound effects designer, before cluttering up the essential bare stage of the original production, which had encouraged the audience to fill the gaps with their imagination. The London production quickly became an overproduced mess, and Alan recalls watching the show die with a morbid fascination. It also alerted Alan to the fact that what could work enormously well in the round might not be quite so successful in the proscenium arch, another foreshadowing of the issues Alan would experience transferring his works from Scarborough to the West End. The play opened on 6th of August 1964 at the New Arts Theatre and would close just 2 weeks later on the 22nd of August. He received some of the most vitriolic reviews of Alan's entire career and, in terms of duration of the run, Mr. Whatnot is the biggest flop of Alan's West End career. Even his and Andrew Lloyd Webber's flop musical Jeeves at least ran for a month before coming to an ignominious end. The experience was a sobering one for the then 24-year-old writer. There were some real tigers prowling around then. Bernard Levin was in full swing, Milton Schulman at his most venomous. I went to bed for 2 days after their reviews and seriously thought of going back to acting and directing. Instead, I went scurrying for cover to the BBC, where I became a Leeds-based radio drama producer for 5 years. It also began a lifelong distaste for reading what critics thought of his work, and Alan later joked he preferred to judge a play by its returns rather than its reviews. It was a painful introduction to London and the West End, and what was more deeply felt was the fact Alan believed an enjoyable play had been spoilt by the experience. I think, in retrospect, Mr. Whatnot was a charming piece done in the round in Stoke. It was a team of actors who'd worked together for a long time and joined in the spirit of it. And then it got the West End treatment, which was to echo through the rest of my life. In the West End it was overproduced. It had a very starry cast: Ronnie Barker, Ronnie Stevens, Mary Law, Judy Campbell, and all the right ingredients, but it just didn't add up. And what is more, it was very funny when we did it in Stoke. Mr. Whatnot went, in the space of 8 months, from being his most successful show yet to his greatest failure, and it could well have spelt the end for Alan's aspirations as a playwright. As it was, we have Mr. Whatnot to thank for fast-tracking his writing success. Soon after it closed in London, and despite having got the new job at the BBC, Stephen Joseph contacted Alan about writing a new play for the Library Theatre in Scarborough's summer season. It was a conversation which Alan would take to heart and would pass on to writers he himself has encouraged over the years. I was, at that time, a very anarchic, very young dramatist who was very determined, as any new writer, to make his mark. I wanted to be different from the establishment and not to be seen as another one of those old-fashioned writers. And Stephen Joseph said to me, "Why don't you just try to write a play like them, to see if you can do it?" Because, as he pointed out, it is much easier to break the rules once you know where they are and what they are. Alan accepted the challenge and went from Mr. Whatnot, a play which broke every theatrical rule Alan could find, to Meet My Father, a well-constructed, tightly written comedy which we know better today as Relatively Speaking. This was Alan's first West End success, and it's still performed around the world more than 5 decades on. It is interesting to reflect that without Mr. Whatnot, there's no reason to suppose Alan would have written Relatively Speaking and thus launched one of the most successful writing careers in British theatre during the latter half of the 20th century. And what of Mr. Whatnot? Time has vindicated the play, and that it was the first West End production rather than the play itself that was the issue. Alan himself would direct it again in 1968 as an amateur production for Leeds Art Theatre, casting an aspiring young actor called Bob Peck in the lead role. He would also direct it in Scarborough as the opening production at the company's second home, the Stephen Joseph Theatre in the Round, and it proved to be more popular than anticipated in both professional and amateur circles following its West End failure. That Alan himself is proud of it is singularly demonstrated in the fact that it is the earliest of his works which is available to produce and which has been published. Nothing written prior to Mr. Whatnot has ever or will ever be released for performance or publication, which inarguably makes Mr. Whatnot a play of significance to understanding the playwright. It is the first play which the playwright considers to be a truly Ayckbourn work, his first play to transfer to the West End, and without it, he would not have been given the impetus to write the play which would become his first major success and, more importantly, set him on the path which would define him. For relatively speaking, not only secured the first of many West End successes, but it also gave him the opportunity to run his own theatre company in Scarborough, enabling him to write and direct whatever he wanted. And if relatively speaking is the play which enables that and all his subsequent success, then we have to consider that Mr. Whatnot is the play which enabled relatively speaking and should be regarded as such. Thank you for listening to Spotlight on Mr. Whatnot. If you've enjoyed this, please subscribe to the Ayckbourn channel.